Welcome to The Stumbling Spirit, contemplations on the path of resilience. Whether you realize it or not, you are resilient. It's your birthright. As you take in your next breath, know this truth. It's not only about your capacity to overcome difficult situations, but it's about your courage to do the necessary work to heal, learn, grow, and move forward. What you gain is invaluable wisdom. And it's through these hard stumbles in life that we often discover a new purpose that aligns with our spirit. My name is Fabio da Silva Fernandez, Reiki Master, Mindfulness Coach, and Mystical Explorer. Join me weekly as the Stumbling Spirit podcast highlights the lives of extraordinary people like you, sharing transformative stories and beneficial practices of resilience to guide you on your wellness journey. In 2001, Heather Harris experienced complications during childbirth after 31 hours of labor. It was a mother's worst nightmare. Her baby's life was at risk. Oxygen deprivation caused her firstborn son immediate seizures and a permanent brain injury that would forever impact his motor control. He was later diagnosed with cerebral palsy. Roughly 18 million people globally have cerebral palsy, with 1 million of those cases living in the US. In Canada, there are over 80,000 with this disorder, which affects about 2 out of every 1,000 children. Here to talk about her journey as a parent to support her disabled and exceptionally gifted son is real estate broker, podcaster, and dear friend, Heather Harris. Hi, Heather.
Hey, Fab. I am so excited to be here today.
Me too. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I should say that those stats that I mentioned just now come from cerebralpalsyguide.com, the Cerebral Palsy Canada Network, and Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital. So just to anchor us in the conversation, I want to define what cerebral palsy is for our listeners. According to Cerebral Palsy Canada Network, cerebral palsy refers to a group of disorders in the development of motor control and posture occurring as a result of a non-progressive impairment of the developing central nervous system, so essentially the brain. And according to the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development based in the US, cerebral palsy is caused by damage or abnormal development in the parts of the brain that control movement. These events can happen before, during, or shortly after birth, or in the first few years of life when the brain is still developing. In many cases, the exact cause of cerebral palsy is not known. So, Heather, I wanted to start with this. I mean, you and I, we've been dear friends for many years. Mm-hmm. And of course, I know what you went through at that time in delivering Ben. And of course, the challenges that you've had with him over the years. But it was only recently that I actually heard you say that he had cerebral palsy. So I just wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit. Did you ever feel reticent or unsure or fearful about talking about Ben's cerebral palsy?
No, actually, quite the opposite. When we finally got the diagnosis of cerebral palsy, he was, I think, 2.5 or 3 years old. And it was so liberating for me and really for Ben too, because then we could access the services that he needed. It may just have never come up because sometimes it was easier to talk about the actual symptoms that he expressed rather than the label when it came to talking to my friends or trying to educate my family. But the term cerebral palsy, that label, was very, very handy and very, very welcome when it came to speaking to developmental pediatricians and neurologists and that kind of thing.
So let's go back in time 23 years ago. Did you have a normal pregnancy?
Yeah, that's a good question, Fab, because in some ways, I think I did medically. I mean, there was a little bit of a scare of preterm labor, but medically it was pretty normal. What was not quite normal was that I had had two miscarriages prior to this pregnancy. So I was petrified that anything would go wrong over the course of that 9-month period. Scared to the point of like, I was afraid to dance. I was terrified to do anything that might rock that boat. But yeah, medically, I think fairly normal. And the plan was to have a pretty normal, typical childbirth in hospital and with an obstetrician, natural delivery. But then it didn't turn out that way. And, you can make all the plans in the world, but the universe sometimes has little surprises for you.
No kidding. And it being your first child, it must have been a really exciting time preparing for your firstborn.
Oh, yeah. I was like nesting like crazy and had the whole nursery set up. And Greg and I were really excited because we had actually made it to, the end game and we were going to have a baby. We had been trying for a few years. And, miscarriage is it's a really traumatic experience for anybody involved. And so, yeah, we were really, really, really excited. But, it's so funny reflecting on it. I worked in early childhood at the time, and I had this inkling that I would have a child with special needs. And it wasn't something that I ever really verbalized, but I just had, maybe it was a fear. I don't know. Or maybe it came from working with some kids with special needs, but I always just had a suspicion that that might be the case. And in fact, I turned down the testing that you have for Down syndrome and all that because I knew, regardless of what the scenario was, I was not going to do anything with this pregnancy. It was very, very special to me. Kind of interesting in that regard, considering how things turned out.
You opted, like many women, to have a natural childbirth. And at 31 hours of labor, the doctor notices that the umbilical cord is wrapped around your son's neck,
Mhm.
but that also your son's shoulder was stuck in the birth canal. Can you walk us through what happened when you were giving birth?
Yeah. So when it came to push comes to shove and things were really starting to rock and roll, Ben crowned and what happens is the head comes out first, typically, unless it's a breech birth. And that's when my obstetrician saw the umbilical cord wrapped around his neck, which is not entirely uncommon. And what you do is you cut it at that time to allow for delivery. But then right afterwards, his shoulder became lodged in the birth canal. So he's no longer receiving the oxygen from the umbilical cord, but he can't breathe either because he hasn't been fully delivered. And of course, right at that moment, I had no idea what was going on, but my doctor became visibly alarmed and started calling in all of the medical support. Within seconds, I had three nurses on my stomach pushing. And I remember my fabulous obstetrician shouting at me, Heather, just push like you have never pushed in your life. And it makes me emotional reflecting on it because it was terrifying. It was terrifying. But by divine intervention, our little Ben was delivered, but he was not in a good state. He had been without oxygen. I think they had thought somewhere between a minute and a half and 2 minutes. And his APGAR score, which is sort of an assessment of health and well being at birth, was a 2. I think it's out of 10, but it was low. And he was immediately seizing nonstop. So I didn't see him when he was born. He was immediately whisked off to the NICU or the neonatal ICU. And I was left there to get stitched up, just in absolute shock. And with my husband, who was also in shock. It was very, very traumatic. And then Greg followed Ben to the NICU. And then the next thing I remember, I was in a hospital bed bawling my eyes out.
So,
Yeah.
just to clarify for our listeners, you mentioned the APGAR score,
Mhm.
and you are right. It is scaled between 0 and 10, and it is a standardized way for healthcare workers to determine the health of a newborn. According to Mount Sinai in New York, what is typical for a child that is born normally is that they score between 7 and 9. Ben was scored at 2. So this really does indicate and underscore that his life was truly at risk.
Oh, we did not know if he would survive. He was within an inch of death, which was terrifying. And not only just, in the crisis itself, but in the hours and days to follow, too.
So you mentioned that he was in the NICU and he was there for a 2 week period. You mentioned that he was in isolate as well. So for our listeners, isolate means that they're effectively in a crib that is surrounded by plastic to protect the child from any germs in the atmosphere, etc. Can you describe that period of time, that 2 week period of what was going on with Ben being there and you in hospital healing and just waiting for the latest news on the health of your child?
It was a surreal time. Ben was born 6 days before 9/11. So I remember that day hearing what had happened in New York City, that horrendous tragedy, and feeling like I had to run and grab Ben out of the ICU and walking into the hospital and seeing all the doctors and nurses just staring at this incredibly horrible event taking place on television. So that marks it in my mind, as well as, the daily trauma and uncertainty. For the first couple of days, Ben was on phenobarbital to get the seizures under control because his brain had been damaged. And so he was a very sleepy, big baby. He was the biggest baby in there because most of them were all little tiny preemies and they were just adorable. And I remember really feeling you could see that determination even in these tiny little freshy newborn creatures to survive. And for all of the people, whether they were parents or nurses or doctors, willing them to survive. It was, even though it was, most of the parents were experiencing trauma, it was also a very hopeful, incredible environment. Some of the nurses there, I can't even tell you how much I respect and adored them. They were just life-changing for me. But when I first saw Ben, and it was probably about 4 or 5 hours after he was born, I felt so disconnected because he was in this isolette. I couldn't hold him. I couldn't cuddle him. I couldn't nurse him. I couldn't do anything. And so I remember singing Baby Beluga to him. And it was just with that little song that attachment started to form. It's a really interesting thing, I think, as mammals, how we bond with our offspring. And when they're ripped away from you right away, there's something physiological, I think, that occurs that damages that initial attachment. It was a long 2 weeks. It was like a battle to just keep going. I started trying to take control of the situation myself to give myself a little bit of agency in the situation, and recorded like the milliliters he was taking in through his tube in his nose of formula. And it was hard. It was very uncertain. We had no idea what was to come, and no one could tell us what was to come. We didn't know if he was going to survive.
What was it like when you were finally able to hold Ben in your arms? You mentioned that there was a bit of a detachment that you had because he was pulled away from you immediately. So
Yeah.
what was it like holding him in your arms?
Well, I got to hold him within a few days of his birth, and just for short little periods of time. It was amazing. I felt this overwhelming assurance within myself that this kid, they could tell me everything. And I was told all kinds of things about what his future would be. And I knew that this kid was going to overcome. He was such a little fighter right from the get go. He just improved day to day. And when I talk about improving, I mean like literally when I talk milliliters of formula, that's what we were going on. We were looking at his movements because at the beginning, he had movements that were really reflective of serious brain damage. He had abnormal neurology reports, EEGs, but every day there would be something that I would write down in my little journal because I kept a journal every day. I didn't see the bicycle movements today, or he had 40 milliliters and didn't regurgitate it. There were just little improvements every day. And that continued his whole life until even today.
And just for our listeners, that's rain in the background. It's
Mhm.
just part of the ambiance of this interview right now. What was it like in Ben's first 2 years of life?
Yeah, that's a big question. I was thrown into a world that I was very unfamiliar with. I was a fish out of water. Like, it's hard enough to be a brand new parent, but then you add on the fact that your child is medically compromised. It's really hard. There are a lot of great supports where I live in Toronto, but finding them felt slow. And finding the right ones was for us was difficult. I think what really defined the first couple of years was uncertainty and fear and isolation. I tried to go to a couple of mom and baby groups, but Ben was very sensitive to sound. So music groups were out. I was really looking forward to doing mom and baby yoga. And I went to one on the Danforth. And I remember because Ben wasn't able to nurse, he had a disorganized suck and was never able to. And so he was bottle fed. And he started fussing during this yoga class with all these other mums. And I brought out a bottle and there were open glares. No one would speak to me. And part of it was probably my own insecurity. And I don't know if the word is shame, but I think there was shame. I was made to feel shame, I think. And I picked him up and left. And I was lucky enough to find my community at a place called Play and Learn, which was an integrated nursery school run by Holland Bloorview. And there were other moms with kids who were compromised, medically compromised, or had special needs of some kind, as well as parents whose kids were typically developing. And that was a safe haven and a godsend for me and for Ben.
I'm really sorry to hear about what happened to that yoga studio. So, do you think that the glares were because you were bottle feeding Ben, or was it because you weren't breastfeeding Ben, or was it because you think that the class was interrupted? What was your interpretation of that?
I don't think it was because the class was interrupted because there were other babies who were kind of fussy. I don't know for sure. Maybe I was overly sensitive. That could definitely be the case. But I felt that it was because I wasn't nursing. Everybody else was. It was something I wanted to do, obviously, but couldn't do, which was also hard for me. I wanted to have that full maternal experience. And, I fully support, I breastfed my other two children because they didn't have, any obstacles. But there was more judgment, I think, at that time from mothers to mothers. But I think things hopefully have gotten better in that regard.
And this was also a scary time too, because you were bottle feeding Ben, but you mentioned to me that he ran the risk of choking as well.
Yeah. And he had terrible reflex too. So just the whole being able to eat on his own was not a certainty in our lives. In fact, we had one occupational therapist who was just a nightmare say to me when he was 4 months old, he was very fussy at this appointment. And she said, your child is not going to eat on his own. He's not going to walk on his own, and he will not be able to live on his own. And I'm happy to say my child has proven her wrong. And actually, during that appointment, I didn't believe her. I just picked him up and said, okay, well, we'll see. And I never went back.
Wow.
Yeah.
That must be really challenging as a parent too, because no one knows your child more than you. And even though Ben has a condition, you have an intimacy of knowledge about your son and his development that no professional will ever know. And they're just basing it on that specific moment that they're seeing your child and they're assessing, and they are also basing it on the general experience of what they've seen with their
Mhm.
other patients. And so that must have been really frustrating for you.
It was very frustrating for me. In fact, it made me angry and still makes me angry to this day because I feel that if I had believed what she had told me about Ben's future, I may have acted in a way that would have limited him. I may have acted in a way that gave him the message that he couldn't eat on his own, walk on his own, live on his own, be on his own. And I wouldn't have done the things that I did, in terms of his therapy. I gave him therapy 6 times a day for months and months and months. And he went to therapy until he was like OT and physical therapy until he was 10 years old. I may not have done those things if I thought it was a foregone conclusion that he was never able to achieve, mobility the way he has. I mean, the kid's a runner now. So I feel that healthcare practitioners, they need to be very, very careful if they're going to make predictions about a child's future. We don't understand a child's capacity to overcome or even understand the brain well enough to make those kinds of predictions.
Well, one of the healthcare professionals that you had a really good relationship with was Ben's pediatrician, who confirmed that Ben had cerebral palsy when he was 2 or 3 years old, which you've mentioned. You also say that it was one of the best days of your life. You talked a little bit about it, but can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Yeah, it must sound strange to people. Your child gets diagnosed with this lifelong challenge. But for me, it was liberating. It was a developmental pediatrician at Holland Bloorview. And we had been limping along, just trying to figure out, cobble together what some trusted professionals were telling us, what we innately thought that he needed. But when she gave us that diagnosis, it just all clicked into place. It was so reassuring in some way because Ben's cerebral palsy is not, it's mild on the scale of, how it can manifest. So when you first meet Ben, you may not know that he has cerebral palsy. It's not as obvious, especially now, but even when he was a child. So to get the services and support, it was a little challenging because of that. But now we had a report, like it was in writing, this diagnosis that I could take to obtain him services. And it was a very, very meaningful moment. And even still to this day, I think it's something that, he identifies with. It's who he is. It's part of who he is. You have brown hair. Well, you have cerebral palsy too. So yeah, it was a really positive moment in that journey.
You said that Ben's cerebral palsy is mild within the spectrum of cerebral palsy that exists out there. Can you elaborate a little bit about what that spectrum looks like?
Yeah, typically it affects the motor center of the brain. So it can affect the tightness of your muscles or the laxness of your muscles. And that means every muscle. So it could be, the muscles in your jaw, in your mouth, in your tongue, in your eyes, in your limbs, most certainly, in your fingers and your toes. So some people, it's quite pronounced and they can't walk and they do have difficulty feeding themselves and they require a lot more support. It doesn't affect you cognitively. So Ben on that spectrum, he definitely affected his motor skills. He was very delayed in, being able to sit and crawl and walk. that kind of thing. His fine motor skills certainly were very compromised. So it was hard for him to learn how to write. He still can't tie a shoelace, to save his life. He worked on it really, really hard. It's just not worth it. And it does affect his ability to chew and swallow as well. So, just going back to that choking risk, we've had some very, very scary situations with choking with Ben. So, and that can be something that can be life-threatening. So yeah, there's a wide spectrum. And, if you're in a wheelchair, it's much more visible and people acknowledge that you have some challenges. But with Ben, he can fortunately walk on his own. So it's more of a hidden disability.
You say that every milestone in Ben's childhood development was like climbing Mount Everest. What do you mean by that?
When you have a child, especially your first child, you read all the baby books and they say, okay, well, between 6 and 9 months, they're going to crawl. And then between 9 and 10 months, they're going to pull up on things. And then they're going to walk within a year. And there's this sort of prescribed timeline that kids are going to do things within. And it extends past that. And it, sort of translates into cognitive things like reading and writing and all that stuff down the road. But in the beginning, it's really focused on motor skills. We had no idea what the outcome was going to be. We had no idea if Ben would ever be able to walk or to sit or to crawl or anything. It started with sitting. And I remember, just if we take sitting, for example, I did OT with him every day, multiple times a day. And I would have to force him. I was taught by an occupational therapist how to maneuver his body so that he would learn that muscle memory to get himself into a sitting position. And that took months. That's just one example, but every milestone required that sort of intensive, regular support. But then when he would do it, it was like earth shattering. I remember we had rented a cottage with my family, and Ben, I think, was almost a year old, and he wasn't walking yet, and he wasn't pulling up on anything yet. And all of a sudden, Ben pulled himself up onto a chair and actually took a step along this chair, holding onto this chair. And I could burst into tears right now. I burst into tears. We all did, because we thought, oh my God, this kid is going to walk. He's going to actually do it. And then we had a fabulous OT who worked with Ben and me to get him to be able to walk. And she was relentless and beautiful and fun. And I still send her a Christmas card with an update on him every year. He wouldn't have walked without her, I don't think. But I remember the days when he would wibble wobble across the living room floor. It was unreal, the joy. It was unreal. So there are some real gifts along the way in this journey.
For our listeners, when you say OT, what you are talking about is occupational therapy or occupational therapist. And that was one of the therapies, one of the many therapies that Ben had over the years. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the kinds and range of therapies that Ben needed?
Yeah. So in the beginning, it was very much intensely focused on neurology, on occupational therapy. There's a window in the beginning that you really need to start that therapy and get them going. There was physiotherapy, there was developmental pediatricians, there were pediatricians. There is just so many people, social workers in the very beginning, to help us navigate this new landscape that we were so like fish out of water on. There were just so many professionals involved with trying to get him to a place where he could thrive on his own. And it was all worth it. It was difficult to navigate because we had no idea which direction we would need to be going from month to month. So you had to sort of go with the flow. We had great advice, especially through Holland Bloorview. They are an incredible, incredible institution. Even the swim lessons, he would do swim lessons, I put in quotations, but that was all at Holland Bloorview too. So there was also a therapeutic aspect to swim. I'm probably forgetting half of it. It was a bit of a blur, really, for the first 5 years for sure, and even 10 years.
You mentioned earlier that glimmer of hope when you saw Ben pull himself up at the cottage and take his first step. At what point did you say to yourself, in a very clear way, you know what? He's going to be okay?
I think maybe when he first walked, but I'm not sure if there ever was that moment. It was more like a fierce resolve. And I think it was in the face of people who didn't believe in him. So I don't know if there was ever like a moment where I could relax and think he's out of the woods. It was a really deep, deep belief that he was going to rise above. And, even though we had all these supports in place and, I was doing the therapy, it wasn't me who got him to that place where he sat up or crawled or walked or, managed to go to kindergarten or all of the different milestones that he achieved over those first years. It was him. He is such a remarkable example of determination, of resilience, of courage. And even though he struggles sometimes with his own self worth and self esteem, he knows who he is. He doesn't rely on other people to tell him who he is. And obviously, he's been a gift because we love him unconditionally. He's our child. But this experience of going through his development and his achievement in life has been such an education, but it's been a gift.
Despite Ben's disability, he very easily got along with his classmates. He was able to socialize really well. Part of the challenges that he had in elementary school was that he was dealing with emotional dysregulation and anxiety due to his brain injury. So, what challenges did this present you as a parent, and how did you support your son through it?
That's a really good question because at the beginning, when he started demonstrating emotional dysregulation, which is just kind of like not being able to manage your emotions, he was young. So we didn't know, we couldn't separate a temper tantrum from, really not being able to manage his emotions when he was a small child. And also hand in hand with very, pronounced anxiety. And the anxiety manifested when he was young as separation anxiety. He did not want to be even in another room from me. I remember one day counting how many times he checked on where I was, even if I was in the same room with him. And it was, we were at 17 times by 9:30 in the morning. Like it was intense. So then over some time, we realized that this was another aspect that we had to support and provide him with assistance. And it was challenging because, I mean, anybody with any kind of emotional challenges or a disorder or anxiety or any kind of mental health issue will know that it does have an impact on your social relationships. And particularly as kids, when they're new to it, anybody who kind of falls outside of that norm is going to be less likely to form strong bonds. We were really fortunate to have a small neighborhood school, and the moms there were fantastic. In fact, I was out for a run with them this morning. So there was kind of a built-in social group for him. So he was able to learn the social skills that he needed at that time, even though he was struggling to manage these other aspects of his brain injury. So now today, like as you say, he's a very social guy and has no issues making friends and having a really strong social group. But it was challenging as a parent to watch him not be able to participate in the same way with the other kids, whether it was his motor skills that kind of got in the way because he obviously couldn't play soccer or hockey or these kinds of things. or whether it was his sensitivity when it came to his anxiety that got in the way. It was hard to see him struggle and be on the outside. And there were definitely some difficult days there. But the thing with Ben is that even if he would have a difficult day, I would be perseverating on it and worried for his future and catastrophizing and thinking about, oh my gosh, what am I going to do to help this poor kid? Like literally within hours, he'd be bounced right back and all positive and ready to go. And he just never let anything weigh him down. He was just always forward moving, which was a lesson to me too.
You say that anxiety was a big part of Ben's journey. What can you share about that?
Yeah, as I mentioned, like it first started to manifest as separation anxiety. He also had a really, and still does, a very strong sense of right and wrong. So if he was unjustly accused, or if someone else was treated unfairly or unjustly accused, it would really cause him a lot of anxiety that he would share. He was not quiet about his anxiety, that's for sure. He would become visibly upset, especially as a young child. And then later on, he would try and find a story to tell about the anxiety he felt in his body. So it could be an exam coming up or, something happening in the world that he could attach to that feeling in his body. And so anxiety has been a work in progress for his entire life. And not only does he come by it honestly through the brain injury, but I had a generalized anxiety disorder. So he's also probably genetically predisposed. And anybody who's had anxiety, even if it's just momentary, it's pretty uncomfortable. And it takes some time to figure out what are the best tools for you to manage it. It's a work in progress, but he's doing pretty well.
First of all, I'm really happy that his anxiety is being managed at the moment. I think that's amazing. So you say that once he got to middle school and high school that he didn't really need as many of the supports that he needed when he was much younger. And despite his developmental challenges, that he was considered gifted. So how did that make you and Greg feel as parents, knowing that your son, despite his cerebral palsy, was doing really well in school?
Yeah, well, and I'll tell you, when he was born, I remember leaving the hospital to go have a shower. Greg and I left for 2 hours to go have a shower and come back. And on that car ride, we were both in tears. And I remember us saying, all we want for him is that he has his mind so that he can enjoy life, so that maybe he could have a relationship when he's older, so that he can have favorite restaurants and read books and, all the things that we take for granted. So when it came to that point in time and we realized not only does he have his mind, but he's pretty sharp cookie, I think that's maybe when I realized he was going to be okay. Maybe that was the time I realized he's going to be just fine. It manifested in a really funny way. And we knew he was a little bit different in the way he was thinking because he would deep dive, like he knew the name of every train in every country around the world by age 3. You know what I mean? Like he just would deep dive into these weird things. So we knew there was something a little different about him. I really don't like the term gifted because it connotes like a privilege or a elitism. It's actually, they need special education, these kids, because they think differently. And sometimes it's really hard for them to succeed in school. But being in that program of special education was life changing for him. Life changing. One of the reasons was that all of the kids, to some degree or another, had social struggles or challenges or obstacles that they had to overcome in life. So they were all kind of cut of the same cloth. But also, there was a care and attention of the staff, particularly this one principal who was just a godsend of that program in his school that just gave him that hope and inspiration and desire to achieve and to follow his own curiosity. And it's led him, he's in graduate school. the giftedness was a gift for sure for all of us.
This journey that you've had as a parent of a child with cerebral palsy came with its sacrifices as well. And one of the things that you say is because a lot of the attention was focused on Ben, that maybe you weren't able to spend as much time with your two other children. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. This is a big issue for families who have a child who is special needs, whether it's, something physical like Ben or emotional or mental health or whatever it is. If there is a child who is struggling, often a lot of attention will be drawn to that child and at the expense of the other children because you just only have so much time and attention and bandwidth. And it's something we talk about openly with our kids. But there were times that were really painful for me. I'll give you an example. My youngest was going on his first field trip in junior kindergarten. We were all ready to go, and Ben had an episode right then, just as I was about to get on the school bus. And I had to hand off my little guy to another mom and say, just can you look after him? He was 3 years old and go manage Ben. And it's hard not to feel resentment. I think it's a real thing to feel that, why do I have to miss out on this? And why does this child have to miss out on this? Because, again, you've got something going on. But it also has been, I think, a benefit to my other kids because they are very tolerant. They're very inclusive of other people. They're very understanding. They don't have a judgmental bone in their body. They're kind and beautiful people because they also had to play a role in Ben's development, even though that they were younger. They were in the same school. Kids would come up to them and say, "What's going on with your brother?" and put them on the spot. I think it was hard for them. I think they would openly admit that it was really difficult at times, but it also made us all closer. We're very, very tight knit because we all, Ben included, all had to navigate all of that uncertainty and stress together.
When you say resentment, are you saying on the part of your other children?
No, I say that on behalf of myself. There were times where, I remember we had this one great party planned with my friends, and at the last minute, I couldn't attend because Ben was having some issues. Well, it's hard. Your life is not your own. And I think every mother would say that, whether your child had special needs or not, your life is not your own. And things come up and there's sacrifice involved. And I don't resent that. But yeah, there were a couple of moments where I'm like, oh God, just my resources were depleted and it was just harder to take.
What did those episodes look like?
Well, in elementary school, there were a couple of times where he took off from school. His fight or flight response is flight. So he will bolt, or when he was young, he would bolt. Fortunately, I do have a running group. And so my good friend ran him down, tackled him on the street, and got him back to school. But so they could be quite dramatic. It becomes a big event. And if there's children around, they're like, wow, what's going on? The teachers are running all over the place. The child's escaped the playground. And so, yeah, typically it would be something like that. He could get very upset, cry. One time in the junior kindergarten playground, he ran into the playground structure and put his teeth through his lip. But he was having such a good time with his friends that he didn't want to go. And I was like, well, you have to go. Your teeth are outside of your lip, kid. Like we're going home now. And he just couldn't absorb that change. He wanted to stay, even though while he was crying, he was spitting blood all over the place. So yeah, sometimes it was really, really, really difficult. But, it was all part of the same journey. And there were ups and downs. There were definitely ups and downs.
There was also a personal sacrifice in that you paused your career and you took a 10-year hiatus. How did that impact you?
Well, it's interesting because right before I had Ben, I had started a master's of education with a focus on developmental psych. And then I had Ben, and I was still in the program. I was going part-time. And I thought, oh my God, I can't do this for a living. I'm already doing it for a living. So in that 10 years I was home, I did finish my master's degree. So I was occupied. It was quite a struggle at some points. And I had two other children too. So it was a kooky, busy time. The real struggle, I was so occupied with Ben and my other two kids that I felt like I was working overtime every day anyway. And it was valuable work. But then when Ben was more settled and, was in his middle school, high school years, I really needed to find something that was just for me. And that's when I got into real estate because it was flexible and I could set my own hours and I could respond to Ben if he needed, and my other kids, of course, as well. But going back to work, I think a lot of women experience this if they did stay home with their kids for any reason. Going back to work or getting into the workforce again it's a transition, and it's difficult sometimes because you do have that gap in your employment record. It's a big gaping hole on your resume, and you always have to explain why. And, I wasn't sitting around eating, chocolates and watching TV for 10 years. You know what I mean? So why we have to explain it, I don't know. But that was kind of hard, and trying to find a new identity, right? Because career is really integral to our identities. And so that was hard too. Yeah, I think it can impact our sense of self-worth when we don't have that title to define us. But I am long over that.
You mentioned Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital as one of the places that really helped you and Ben, particularly early in his development. What other organizations and support systems helped you and your family?
Well, I really think that they were the key players. We did have our occupational therapist that was publicly provided was incredible. She came to us through the CCAC, but then we paid for private therapy because you just couldn't get it as often as he required it. And so we paid for that. That was a financial sacrifice. And we paid for psychologists, and there was a point where he needed a shadow at school that was really, really expensive. But it was really Holland Bloorview because the fact that they offered this nursery school that provided not only the things that he needed for his development, it provided me with a community that I could relate to. Before that, I was so isolated, and I was a brand new mother too. I didn't have anybody that understood my experience at all. So that was pivotal for me personally as a parent, and obviously for Ben. Most of the services that we availed ourselves of came through them. And whether it was OT to tie his shoes or to type, he took typing classes there, swimming so that he could, understand his body and movement in space. I mean, there was all kinds of things that they offer. Music. It's just an incredible, incredible facility. And they were the nexus of our support.
You mentioned earlier that Ben is in graduate studies at the moment. He's completing his master's degree in public history in Ireland. Was it ever hard for you and Greg to envision this day? What does it mean to you both that Ben is one step further to attaining independence?
It's incredible. Like if we go back to the milestones, I remember thinking it was every step of the journey. Well, if I can just get him through middle school, if I can just get him to graduate high school, if he can just get his undergrad, although he was well on his way when he got his undergrad. But, every milestone is still massive. And now he's fully independent financially and physically. He's in another country. He is currently traveling around and having a grand old time managing his future. He has got published works. He is contemplating a PhD. He's applying for all kinds of jobs post his master's degree. Yeah, he's launched. And even though, I mean, we all have things that we deal with and try and process and try and work with and work beyond and work towards. He has things still that he is working on. He's done it. And I knew when that woman said to me, your child is never going to be able to function independently in any way. I knew she was wrong. And she was. She was dead wrong. It's wonderful to see him thriving in the way he is. It's beautiful.
It is beautiful. As parents, where did you and Greg derive your support?
Definitely, we relied on our family. My mom actually took early retirement to help me in the very early years, but we relied on each other, and we still do. But on the days that I was feeling hopeless or low or devastated or tapped out, he'd pick up the slack and he would step in and vice versa. And that's how we parent too. If someone is too taxed to deal with some kid issues, then the other one can step in. And we're fortunate in that we've always seen eye to eye and we've always agreed on the course of action. I don't think Greg ever doubted too that what Ben was capable of, even though we really had nothing to base it on. And there have been times where we've both been really scared or really sad. And we're definitely changed because of that day in 2001. And in fact, when his birthday rolls around, it's emotional for both of us. It was definitely trauma. But yeah, Greg has always had my back and I've always had his. And I know that having children who have issues or special needs or disability, it can be really trying and taxing on a relationship. It's hard work. It's really hard. It could be a destructive force. But for us, it has strengthened our relationship. He's my best friend. I love him to bits. And I just know that we're in it together and we've been in it together and it's been a good journey.
What's one piece of advice that you can offer to moms, parents with children who have cerebral palsy?
Find your people, get involved in the disability community. It is an incredibly beautiful, supportive, inclusive, lovely community. You will find hope there. You'll find connection there. And you'll find love there. Find your people.
What does resilience mean to you?
Resilience means to me that you can weather the storm, but know that your feet are going to stay on the ground. I think resilience comes from going through the things that are really hard in life and reflecting on the fact that you made it to the other side. Even if it wasn't pretty, you made it and you could do it again. And knowing that no matter what life throws at you, it doesn't impact your core. Those things teach you who you are. They teach you that you're strong. They teach you that you're compassionate and able to love and receive love. And so then you become resilient.
What are your practices of resilience?
I do a lot of self reflection. I have done a lot of work on my own self esteem, my own self worth, sense of self worth. And I think that through that, and also observing myself in and through traumatic situations, I think that has led me to be a resilient person. I'm not sure I have a resilience practice, but perhaps even in my little morning routine of setting intentions and meditation, it allows you some space so that you can breathe through and between the tough things. So I think those things might bolster my resilience from day to day.
And how do they benefit you, these practices of resilience?
Well, meditation, oh my gosh, like the list, it's a long list of benefits. I think it just goes a long way in calming the nervous system as we navigate this madly frenetic world. And it allows us to be more resilient within that framework. It's tough, right? It's a stressful world out there. It's hard sometimes. So meditation, I think, it just allows you to sort of sit back a little bit, moment to moment. You don't have to rush in. You don't have to respond. You can just kind of have a little bit of perspective, little bit of space. And in terms of, setting intentions every morning, I try and work out in the morning sort of the things that I want or think I need to focus on. And they're not things like a to-do list. It's not like I have to go to Costco and, pick up my laundry detergent. It's things like I need to be a really good listener today. The things I have in my agenda means that I really need to focus on my listening. Or there's one person who really needs to feel love from me today. Or I need to work on my self-compassion today. Whatever it is, those kinds of things. And I think, that self-work, that perspective on self, an honest perspective on self, helps build resilience, especially if you have a daily or a weekly practice. It will help build your resilience too.
So you co-host a wonderful podcast called At Home and Abroad. Can you describe your show and tell us how we can listen to it?
Of course, yeah. At Home and Abroad with Harris and Walker, I'm the Harris part of that puzzle, is a production that explores a different topic every episode. We have fabulous guests, and we just kind of dive down that rabbit hole of curiosity, trying to figure out, what new angles can we look at these time-told topics. So, for example, we are about to produce an episode on compassion with the Venerable Thubten Chodron, who is a Buddhist nun and abbess of a training monastery in Washington State. That conversation is mind-blowing. That's just an example of what the kind of thing that we will talk about, but we've talked about genocide, allergies, saving money. So it's been a really wonderful creative adventure, but also we feel like we are contributing to the greater good as well. So yeah, it's been a really great adventure with my partner, Lauren Walker.
You are most certainly contributing to the greater good. How can people reach you if they want to contact you?
Oh, well, you can find me on Instagram at Heather Harris Holmes or at Harrison Walker. You can find my podcast website. It's www.harrisandwalker.com.
Heather, thank you so much for joining the show, for sharing your insights, sharing your wisdom, being really open and honest about your experience as a mother, as a parent of a child with cerebral palsy. I know that you're going to help many parents out there. Thank you so much. Such a privilege to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you. It's been a real privilege to be here, Fabio. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to The Stumbling Spirit, Contemplations on the Path of Resilience. This is Fabio da Silva Fernandez. Join me again next week for another episode of transformative stories and beneficial practices to guide you on your wellness journey. If you wish, you can follow and DM me on Instagram at The Stumbling Spirit. Until next time, take a deep breath and another step forward on your path of resilience.